Our last speaker for this session is Dr. Adis Duderija, who is Senior Lecturer in the Study of Islam and Society and former Senior Fellow at the Center for Interfaith and Intercultural Dialogue at Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia. He is recognized internationally in the field of contemporary Islamic studies, especially in relation to his work on the theory of progressive Islam, theories of interfaith dialogue, gender issues, and the Islamic intellectual tradition more generally. He is author of over 50 articles, book chapters, and encyclopedia entries, and the author and editor of over half a dozen books. He serves on the editorial board of several academic journals, and his scholarship has been translated into Arabic, Indonesian, Urdu, Hindi, and Bosnian. Dr. Duderija, I'm sorry about pronouncing your name, Dr. Duderija's paper title is Thinking About Religious Difference and Pluralism from the Perspective of Progressive Islam.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I have the fortune or the misfortune, depending upon your perspective, of being the last speaker. So whatever I say, probably we are all suffering from listening fatigue. So from my perspective, please continue not to engage in listening to me because you're not going to learn much, and I can say whatever I want, and probably you're not going to mind as long as it's all over ASAP. Okay. A couple of more caveats. My paper is intentionally a little bit light on process thought, and there's a lot of emphasis on progressive Muslim thought because it is relatively unknown. I believe you are all experts on process thought, unlike myself, who is a recent, convert. So I'm hoping that as I'm presenting my ideas, we can perhaps together discover synergies between what I have to say and what potentially synergizes or the affinities between what I'm going to present, the way I have theorized progressive Muslim thought and process relational thought. So in my paper, I will start by providing an overview of progressive Muslim thought, as I have tried to theorize over the last decade and a half. And then I'll focus on one particular thinker within this camp of progressive Islam, an Iranian philosopher, Abdul Karim Soroush, who has contributed significantly to religious pluralism from the perspective of progressive Islam. Okay, so progressive Islam is one of several transnational intellectual and social movements in contemporary Islam. The proponents of progressive Muslim thought, both at a scholarly and an activist level, are to be found spread throughout the both Muslim majority and minority contexts. While many of the leading progressive Muslim intellectuals do teach in Western academia, we also find them, as I said, in a Muslim majority cultural and academic contexts. Many of these scholars also have obtained their postgraduate qualifications in Western academia, but many of them significantly also have traditional training, seminary training. Importantly, many of proponents and main theoreticians of progressive Muslim thought are actually women, Muslim women, and in their work they draw significantly on critical feminist discourses, including feminist theology. So what are the main delineating features of progressive Islam as I have tried to envision and theorize it? So I have written two monographs, one published in 2011 and another in 2017, wrestling with this question, trying to kind of shape the contours, delineate the progressive Muslim thought in relation to the Islamic intellectual tradition and essentially, I have argued that progressive Muslim thought is a contemporary articulation of Islamic humanistic and cosmopolitan values, beliefs, and practices, and that its major delineating features could be subsumed under 7 following categories. Number 1, it is an intellectualized and epistemologically contemporary form of Sufi thought based on a panentheistic view of the divine. So we have the panentheistic synergy here. It's an approach that welcomes creative, critical, and innovative thought based on epistemological openness and methodological fluidity. So here the emphasis on creative, innovative thinking, I believe, is also an important synergy with process relational thought. It is a form of Islamic liberation theology. So there are here synergies as well, because many process relational scholars are also contributing to liberation theology, if I'm not mistaken. It is a form of Islam that affirms gender egalitarian or non-patriarchal interpretation of religion or a worldview in general. It is a human rights-based approach to the Islamic tradition that is consistent with the modern human rights era ethos. It is a form of Islamic thought based on rationalist and contextualist approaches to Islamic theology and ethics, and a form of Islamic thought that affirms robust forms of religious pluralism on ontological, epistemological, and hermeneutical grounds. So that's kind of, as I said, I have 2 books on this. If you would like to know more about this, I could direct you kindly to look into them. It is important because I also need to say a few words about how progressive Muslim thought engages with the Quran, with the sacred scripture, because as you are probably aware, Islamic orthodoxy emphasizes a particular view of revelation that does not I guess, lend itself to, it is starkly different from how process relational theology would approach the concept of revelation and sacred scripture. So progressive Islam, progressive Muslim thought, in order to understand the nature of progressive Muslim thought and its relationship to pluralism, including robust religious pluralism, it is essential for us to understand how it approaches the Quran and the nature of revelation itself. So again, as I try to explain in the monographs that I've published in the past, progressive Islam considers the Quran as a socio-culturally produced and a literary discourse or sets of discourses. According to progressive Muslim thought, there is an organic and symbiotic link between the religious environment out of which the Quran emerged and the very nature of the Quran itself. Moreover, from the perspective of philosophy of religion that is embraced by progressive Muslim thought, namely that one informed by process relational metaphysics, the concept of revelation, or what constitutes sources of divine signs, is non-text dependent, but emphasizes the validity of the concept of revelation by pointing to 2 different ideas. Number 1, and again, there are some synergies here with process relational thought, I hope. Number 1, the centrality of human religious experience, including the mystical and the perennialist, as a universal phenomenon, historically and across diverse cultures and civilizations. And the second point through which the concept of revelation is understood is that the natural world and the human rational faculty are also sources of divine signs. These divine signs are repeatedly confirmed in the Quran and are termed the ayat. In this respect, there is a qualitative difference here between progressive Islam's approach to revelation and the nature of the Quran and Islamic orthodoxy. For Islamic orthodoxy, it is the plain ahistorical and non-philosophical reading of the Quran itself and the associated canonical literature that sets the parameters of what constitutes the divine signs. including the Quran itself. Whereas in the progressive Muslim thought, the concept of revelation is a byproduct of a particular approach to philosophy of religion understood from the perspective of process-relational theology, through which Quranic theological ideas are conceptualized and interpreted. This is in part because in progressive Muslim thought, the understanding of the origins and the nature of the Quran are metaphysically different from that of the Islamic orthodoxy, which brings me to my next point. Namely, in concert with process-relational theology and metaphysics more generally, and in contrast with Orthodox Islamic dogma, progressive Islam's approach to scripture as source of divine signs is premised on the metaphysical impossibility of a purely divine text and a metaphysical impossibility of the non-contingent and non-evolving nature of human religious experience, including that is considered to be prophetic. So, from the perspective of progressive Muslim thought, the Quran ought to be interpreted, number one, in the light of the metaphysical parameters of process-relational metaphysics in general and process-relational theology that rejects the concept of a God as conceptualized in classical theism. And two, in light of Quran's intertextuality and the historical context in which the Quran originated. This approach to revelation and the Quran, needless to say, has very important implications on how progressive Muslim thought approaches the question of pluralism, including the religious, since unlike Islamic orthodoxy, it does not metaphysically, philosophically, or hermeneutically privilege the Quran as either the most important or the source of question on the question of pluralism from a normative vantage point. Okay, now that I have said all of this and set the scene, I would like to focus a little bit more on the religious pluralism component with the emphasis on the ideas of the Iranian philosopher Abdul Karim Soroush. The Muslim tradition has employed the Quran and the canonical literature to justify religious exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism in terms of its soteriology. Mainstream theological and legal tradition has been framed in primarily exclusivist and to a lesser extent inclusivist modes, whereas philosophical mysticism and progressive Muslim thought have argued for a pluralist perspective. The Quran on surface level contains verses that are both exclusivist and pluralist in nature. Progressive Muslim theologians do build upon the religiously pluralist tendencies in the pre-modern Islamic tradition, most clearly evident in the pre-modern mystical philosophical trend associated with scholars such as Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi, who died in the 13th century, the Andalus scholar, and Jalaluddin al-Rumi, another famous poet, philosopher that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, also died, a Persian poet who died in the 13th century. So there are these pre-modern pluralist tendencies that progressive Muslim thought does engage with and build upon. But my focus is on Abdul Karim Soroush, who best exemplifies progressive Muslims' approach on the issue of religious pluralism, diversity in our contemporary context. Soroush's support for religious pluralism is framed in the context of contemporary discussions on epistemological pluralism that is embedded in the branch of philosophy known as critical realism. Critical realism is based on the premise of the real epistemological implications of fallibility of human reasoning and understanding without thereby embracing the philosophy of postmodern relativism. And here again, I think there is a synergy between process-relational thought and progressive Islamic thought. Soroush considers religious pluralism as a decidedly modern phenomenon with some historical roots in pre-modernity. For Soroush, religious pluralism is part of a larger set of pluralisms, namely cultural and social pluralism, all of which are, however, organically linked. Soroush argues that in contemporary epistemology, incommensurable religious pluralism is premised on two ideas. The first pertains to the diversity of understanding of religious texts, and the second to the diversity of our interpretation of religious experiences. In addition, from the epistemological perspective, Soroush identifies a number of other additional principles in support of irreducible religious pluralism that he subsumes under two broad categories, namely positive and negative pluralism, and I will discuss this very shortly. The foundational pillar on which both types of pluralisms are justified in the thought of Abdul Karim Soroush is encapsulated in his idea that each human being is imprisoned into an inescapable state of point of viewness, which is the driving force behind diversity and pluralism both in the realm of textual hermeneutics as well as in the sphere of the human experience of transcendence. This is so because Soroush subscribes to a particular view of the nature of reality. He does not consider the mind to be a tabula rasa, and that the humans can objectively and simply retrieve facts from reality. For Soroush, there are no definite, objective, and unambiguous signposts available to humans which would be fully indicative of the nature of true reality, because thinking about, interpreting, and understanding reality is an interminable, collective, and forever dynamic process. However, such a view of reality, insists Soroush, does not amount to embracing postmodernist relativist epistemology. So another point of connectedness, I believe. From the perspective of epistemology of critical realism, Soroush divides religious pluralism into positive and negative kinds. He further subdivides positive religious pluralism, which he also terms irreducible plurality, into two subcategories, namely pluralism in understanding of religious texts and pluralism in interpreting religious experiences. More specifically, Soroush argues that we cannot deny that the Islamic texts, namely the Quran and the Hadith, are multi-layered and can be interpreted in a number of different ways. He argues that this applies to every religion in history, as testified by the study of the history of religion and theology. Soroush laments that this phenomenon of inevitable plurality of interpretations has not been sufficiently theorized from the vantage point of it being something to be welcomed and embraced rather than disparaged. And in this context, he asserts, and I quote, "No one has considered the possibility that this unavoidable plurality of interpretations, conceptions, and sects to which no religion is immune might have some other meaning and significance. Maybe it means that this plurality is itself desirable. Maybe rightful guidance is broader than what we had imagined. Maybe salvation and felicity hinge on something else, something beyond these antagonistic and divisive dogmas and particular conceptions," end quote. Apart from unavoidable pluralism in the realm of understanding of religious texts, another element of positive pluralism identified by Soroush is diversity of interpretation of religious experiences. In this context, Soroush argues that, and I quote, "Just as we have no such thing as uninterpreted religion, we have no such thing as an uninterpreted experience, whether in the natural world or in the world of the soul," end quote. Since religious experience is transcendental in nature, this transcendence takes on different forms. Soroush, like in many other instances of discussing his theories concerning the phenomenon of irreducible religious pluralism, cites Rumi to argue that plurality of points of view will inevitably lead to plurality of views. Importantly, therefore, Soroush forms the view that the first sower of the seeds of pluralism was God, by virtue of sending humanity different messengers to whom he manifested himself, and I do apologize about the gendered language, differently given their own conditions. Furthermore, Soroush finds himself in agreement with John Hick's employment of the Kantian distinction between phenomena and noumena to explain how the multifaceted nature of interpretation is related to the multifaceted nature of reality. Another way Soroush explains positive pluralism is by means of the idea of immersion of truth within truth. Here, Soroush again cites Rumi to argue that pluralism is an inevitable result of accumulation of truths and their intricate interconnectedness. Soroush, in this context, cautions his readers against conceptualizing the world as a series of straight, broken, or crooked lines, but as, and I quote, consisting of an aggregate of straight lines which meet, run parallel, and overlap, immersing truths within truths. How am I going with time? Okay. One element of negative pluralism as theorized by Soroush is the idea of compatibility of all truths because of the virtue of their relatedness. In this regard, Soroush opines that truths are like stars that belong to the same constellation and that reside under the same roof. Hence, truth seekers must ensure that their truth is compatible with that of others. Soroush uses another apt metaphor to explain this idea of complementarity of all truths in the following manner. The contention being made here is that everyone participates in building the wondrous castle of truth, or even more, that everyone should be invited to participate and that the castle should be carried on the collective's shoulders. Now, I will not have time to go into the pluralism at the level of interpretation of texts, so that's another or hermeneutical pluralism at the level of meaning, and given that I am running out of time. So in conclusion, essentially, progressive Muslim thought has great affinities, I believe, with process theology in general and in its affirmation of religious pluralism in particular. While process theologians such as Cobb and Griffith embrace and justify what they term deep religious pluralism primarily on ontological grounds, Soroush's affirmation of irreducible religious pluralism at the most general level is a product of his broader views on epistemological pluralism, as discussed in the branch of philosophy known as critical realism. Soroush theorizes religious pluralism also at several other levels, namely that of understanding of religious texts, religious experiences, and the meaning itself as embodied at the level of sacred texts. He is a strong advocate of a positive pluralism which denies postmodern relativism, celebrates difference, and argues for a reasoned plurality of truths. Thank you very much for listening.